There's a proverb worth remembering here. It goes this way. To a man with a hammer, every problem is a nail. If modern man is scientific man, technology is his hammer. But every problem isn't a nail. Knowledge without the virtue of wisdom, the virtue of prudence, and above all the virtue of humility to guide it, is not just unhelpful, it's dangerous. Gaede's poem, The Sorcerer's Apprentice, which some of us probably know from the Mickey Mouse cartoon based on it, sticks in our mind and our memories for a reason. We're never as smart as we think we are, and we have a bad track record when it comes to preventing the worst use of our own best discoveries. Science involves the study of the material world, but human beings are more than the sum of their material processes. Trying to explain the human person with thinking that excludes the reality of the spiritual, the dignity of the religious, and the possibility of God simply cripples both the scientist and the subject being studied, man himself. To put it another way, we can destroy what we mean by humanity while claiming and even intending to serve it. We might wisely remember one other fact about science. Writer Eric Cohen observed that, quote, "From the beginning, science was driven both by democratic pity and aristocratic guile, by the promise to help humanity and the desire to be free from the constraints of the common man, with his many myths and superstitions and taboos." End of quote. In other words, scientists too often have a divided heart, a sincere desire to serve man's knowledge, and a sincere disdain for what they see as the moral and religious delusions of real men and women. If this doesn't make us just a little bit uneasy, it should. Both faith and science claim to teach with a special kind of authority. One of the differences is this. Most religious believers accept, at least in theory, that they'll be judged by the God of justice for their actions. For science, God is absent from the courtroom. This leads to my third point. God is also absent from the U.S. Constitution, but not because he was unwelcome. In effect, God suffused the whole constitutional enterprise. Nearly all the founders were religious believers, and some were quite devout. Their writings are heavily influenced by biblical language, morality, and thought. America could afford to be secular in the best sense precisely because its people were so religious. The founders saw religious faith as something separate from government, but vital to the nation's survival. In his farewell address, Washington famously stressed that, quote, "Religion and morality are indispensable supports for political prosperity." He then added that, quote, "Reason and experience both forbid us to expect that national morality can prevail in exclusion of religious principles." For John Adams, John Jay, James Wilson, Alexander Hamilton, Charles Carroll, George Washington, and most of the other founders, including Thomas Jefferson and Benjamin Franklin, religion created virtuous citizens. And only virtuous citizens could sustain a country as delicately balanced in its institutions, moral instincts, and laws as the United States. Here's my purpose in mentioning this. The American founders presumed the existence of natural law and natural rights. These rights are inalienable and guaranteed by the Creator, by nature's God, to use the words of the Declaration of Independence. Such ideas may be out of fashion in much of legal theory today, but these same ideas are very much alive in the way we actually reason and behave in our daily lives. For example, most of us here tonight believe that we have basic rights, that come with the special dignity of being human. These rights are inherent to human nature. They're part of who we are. Nobody can take them away. But if there is no creator and nothing fundamental and unchangeable about human nature, and if nature's God is kicked out of the conversation, then our rights become the product of social convention. And social conventions can change. So can the definition of who is and who isn't human. The irony is that modern liberal democracy needs religion more than religion needs modern liberal democracy. American public life needs a framework friendly to religious belief because it can't support its moral claims about freedom and rights with rational and secular arguments alone. In fact, to the degree that it encourages a culture of unbelief, liberal democracy undermines its own grounding. It causes its own decline by destroying the public square's moral coherence. That leads to my fourth and final point. The pro-life movement needs to be understood and respected for what it is. Part of a much larger, consistent, and morally worthy vision of the dignity of the human person. You don't need to be Christian or even religious to be pro-life. Common sense alone is enough to make a reasonable person uneasy about what actually happens in an abortion. The natural reaction, the sane and healthy response, is repugnance. What makes abortion so grievous is the intimacy of the violence and the innocence of the victim. Dietrich Bonhoeffer, and remember this is the same Lutheran pastor who helped smuggle Jews out of Germany and gave his life trying to overthrow Hitler, wrote the following, quote, "The destruction of the embryo in the mother's womb is a violation of the right to live, which God has bestowed on this nascent life. To raise the question whether we are here concerned already with a human being is or not is merely to confuse the issue. The simple fact is that God certainly intended to create a human being, and this nascent human being has been deliberately deprived of his life, and that is nothing but murder." End of quote. Bonhoeffer's words embody Christian belief about the sanctity of the human life present from the earliest years of the Church. Rejection of abortion and infanticide was one of the key factors that set the early Christians apart from the pagan world. From the Didache in the first century through the early fathers of the Church down to our own day, Catholics, and until well into the 20th century all other Christians, have always seen abortion as gravely evil. As Bonhoeffer points out, arguing about whether abortion is homicide or only something close to homicide is irrelevant. In the Christian view of human dignity, intentionally killing a developing human life is always inexcusable and always gravely wrong. Now, working against abortion doesn't license us to ignore the needs of the homeless, or the poor, the elderly, or the immigrant. It doesn't absolve us from supporting women who find themselves pregnant and abandoned. In Catholic belief, all human life, no matter how wounded, flawed, young or old, is sacred because it comes from God. The dignity of human life and its right to exist are guaranteed by God. Catholic teaching on abortion and sexuality is part of the same integral vision of the human person that fuels Catholic teaching on economic justice, racism, war, and peace. These issues don't all have the same content. They don't all have the same weight, but all of them are important. But some are more foundational than others. Without a right to life, all other rights are contingent.